the first new Google Sheets function is called EPOCH and if I go into the spreadsheet and cell B3, if I just write equals, well, first of all, what's an A3? A3 is like a bunch of random numbers, but looks like random numbers, but this is actually a way to represent time, a date and time in Unix. So if I write equals epoch to date, left parentheses, and I put cell A3 inside that formula, you notice I get the date and time February 13th, 2023, 1:49 p.m. in 1:49 a.m. in the morning. So this is a pretty basic one. You typically get these numbers, these epochs coming from like a database output or from a Unix machine. And that's why I gave this usefulness rating a 1 chili pepper, because I don't know how many people are typically getting these epoch times anymore in a database dump. I feel like many modern database tools are dumping your dates in a readable format for humans and not in this epoch date. So this is probably more for older database tools. Just my opinion here. That's what I think. So that's why I think it's a 1 spicy pepper usefulness rating. So not really useful for the average or for the beginner spreadsheet user. Okay, the next one is TOROW and TOCOL, and that's TOROW and TOCOL. So in cells A7 through C10, I have 3 columns of data, group A, B, and C. In column A, I have group A, I have a few names under there, Ben, John, and Agnes. Group B, I have a few names, and then group C, and a few names. And I actually gave this a 5 usefulness rating, the maximum spiciness score. And it allows you to, these formulas allow you to arrange a bunch of cells into a single row or column. And I'm a big fan of this one because it prevents the need to cut and paste. So let's say I have these 3 lists of names in 3 different columns, right? And so if I want to put all these names into one place today, you might copy these names, paste them like here into column E, and then copy the other group B's names, paste them below that first set, so on and so forth. Instead of doing that, you can just write TOCOL. I'm in cell C, E4. I'm going to write equals TOCOL, left parentheses, and just select the names across A through C. And then notice how it just gives me a list of the names in one column. And that might be useful when you want to quickly get basically a list of all the people in your classroom that are organized in groups. You want to get all their email addresses organized in one column. So I think this is a really fun way or simple way to stack your data on top of each other using TOROW. And then the opposite is using TOCOL. The opposite is TOROW, where I can write equals TOROW, left parentheses, select my names, and it just puts everything into one row, which is not as useful compared to TOCOL. So there are some interesting ways you can remove errors from the output, but in general, just writing I think the easier one to use is probably TOCOL, because you're typically organizing your data into a column. All right, so the next one is CHOOSEROWS and CHOOSECOLS. That's CHOOSEROWS, and then CHOOSECOLS. And it basically lets you choose which rows or columns you want from a dataset. And I gave this a usefulness rating of 4 spicy peppers because it's a way, these functions are a way to quickly make it easier for you to filter out the data you don't need from a big dataset. And let's say you want to quickly get the top 3 scores from your dataset, or you want to get the top score and the last score. So in this case, I have cells A14 through E18. I just have a list of students in column A, their math scores in column B, their history scores in column C, so on and so forth. And over in column G, cell G14, I'm going to write equals choose rows, left parentheses, select A14 through E18, which contains my students and all their different test scores. I'm going to put choose rows, left parentheses, A14 colon E18, comma 1, comma 2, comma 3. And you'll see that it just gives me the output of the first 3 rows from that table. So just the student, math, history, science, gym headers. And then below that I have the 2 students, Harry and Jenny, because I only pulled back Well, the first row, when I say choose rows 1, that pulls back the first header row. Then 2 and 3 just pulls back the second and third row below that. So it's a way to quickly pull out rows from your data set. Now, conversely, choose calls. Similarly, you can say equals choose, I'm going to close this little helper thing, choose calls, left parentheses, select my entire data set, A14 to E18, and let's say I only want to choose calls columns 1, 3, and 4. And you'll see that it just gives me the columns of student, history, and science, which correspond to columns 1, 3, and 4 in my data set. So I actually find this choose calls to also be equally useful because you can just pull out the columns of data that matter for you. And this is kind of similar. I think this is actually an easier way to write the bracket syntax, which you might have used before. Especially if you're creating a custom VLOOKUP formula where you're trying to have multiple conditions. If you write equals left bracket, and then select students, which is column A, A14 to A18, then comma, history, which is column C, comma, and then column E, gym, right bracket, you notice that you'll also get those 3 lists inside your Google Sheet. So I think this is choose rows and choose calls are kind of like an easier way, more user-friendly way to write that bracket notation. All right, the next one, number 4, is wrap rows and wrap columns, and that's WRAP rows and then WRAP columns. This one's a little tricky to get used to. In the show notes, I basically say that this is a way to turn a bunch of cells into a specified number of rows or columns. And the usefulness rating I give for these functions is only a 2 because I think it's kind of an interesting formula, but it's only for a specific use case, I think. I'm not sure. Maybe someone can tell me better use cases for this. But you give it a list of cells, like in one column, or it could be multiple columns, I guess, and then you tell it how many rows to turn that one single list into. So, for instance, if you have a list of, in column A, I have a really badly formatted list of data, and it says like name, then location, then age, then job, then below that it says Mary, Florida, 30, sales, John. So imagine that the name, location, age, job, these are what should be your column headers, but instead they're organized like row by row. So it's literally from row 22 starting, it says name, location, age, job, Mary, Florida, 30, sales, John, NYC. All these are basically data that's supposed to be under name, location, and age and job. So if I write equals in cell E29, if I write equals wrap rows, left parentheses, and then say select all my data in column A, comma, I think it's 4 rows. There you go. Notice how it just wraps my long list of data into 4 rows. So it says name, name, location, age, and job are properly along the columns, and so are the actual names of people, their locations, and their ages. So that's one way of using it. I think another way of using this is using 2 wrap columns where you have a list of names and you want to quickly put them into 3 columns or 3 teams. So in column C, I have a bunch of random names, and then column E, F, and G, I have the headers team 1, team 2, team 3. I want to quickly create this list of names. There's 10 names. I want to quickly put them into 3 buckets, these 3 teams. So in cell E23, I'll write equals wrap calls, left parentheses, select my names, comma, 3 columns, comma 3, right parentheses, and actually I want to do 4, because I want to put 4 values of data into each column, and you notice that I can basically get these 3 columns or 3 team names, but notice how like there's these NA cells in the last team 3 because there's only 10 names, but there's technically 12 spots, if you will. So a third parameter in WRAPCOLS is after you put the number 4, you can put something like no name, double quote, and it just replaces those NAs, that pesky little error, with whatever value you put in that last parameter. So it's kind of like an if error. If there's nothing there, just put in whatever no name or whatever. You can even put in a blank double quote, So there's just like empty cells in those empty last two cells because it didn't have enough cells to wrap. So that's WRAPROWS and WRAPCOLS. Also, again, kind of useful, but not very useful to me. So I give it a 2 pepper. Don't think it'll be very useful for beginner spreadsheet users either. VSTACK and HSTACK. This is a kind of an interesting one. I gave it a 3 rating because I think the reason VSTACK might be useful is because, here we go, is because you might have data sources coming from on 3 different Google Sheets in your file. So for instance, in my Google Sheet on the shows 1 sheet, I have a bunch of shows, the type, the title, the director. The show ID you can see goes from 1 through 20 on the first sheet. On shows 2, I have shows 21 through 40. And then shows 3, I have shows 41 through 60. So just 3 tabs of a bunch of shows. And let's say I want to combine all these shows together. There's multiple ways of doing this. And let's say you have some kind of, I don't know, daily like data dump that goes into these 3 different tabs, shows 1, 2, and 3. What if you wanted to create like a primary main table that contains the aggregate view of all of these shows? So in cell A50 on the Google Sheet, what I can do is write equals VSTACK, VSTACK, left parentheses, and then literally go to shows 1 and select everything from A1 through, in this case, it's K21, and then comma, go to shows 2. I'm not going to select the header cell from A1. I'm going to start from A2 down to K21, comma, go to shows 3 tab, and same thing, select from A2, excluding the header, and then going to K21, right parentheses, enter. And the output is simply, in row 50, I have the header columns, show ID, type, title, but if I scroll down, you'll see it just kind of concatenates or adds all the data together, all the shows into one place. So as new data is being added to shows 1, 2, and 3 in these 3 different tabs, the VSTACK will basically combine all that data together into one table or one array, so you don't have to worry about kind of cutting and pasting and doing any kind of like weird Google Apps script hacks. So that's where the VSTACK and HSTACK could come into play. Again, I think it's useful if your data happens to be structured where every single sheet has the perfect exactly structured data like this, where there's the same header columns and it's being updated, but I can't really think of any other interesting use case aside from that. But again, this also feels really similar to CHOOSEROWS and CHOOSECOLS for me because it's a simpler syntax of instead of having to put like the brackets. So it could be an interesting use case for a user-friendly version of using the bracket notation, which is just using VSTACK and then HSTACK. Honestly, I don't know when you use HSTACK in the Google Sheets. Oh, sorry, in the blog post, they talk about how you can like concatenate dates together across the columns, but I find that honestly kind of weird. The final one is let. So let here is, I remember when this first came out, like everyone was going, all the like Excel, Google Sheets, well, first came out in Excel. I think it's called Excel, let in Excel as well, but I remember when it first came out, like all the, Google Sheets and Excel influencers went crazy and were publishing all these, oh my God, this is going to unlock, everything in Google Sheets and Excel. And I was like, I don't get it. Like, it's just a way to assign a variable to a formula. And that's why I gave it a usefulness rating of a two chili pepper, because it already kind of exists with named ranges, to be honest. Like, you can have a formula, output something into cell A1, and then go to the name. I mean, even in Google Sheets, you can, I think there's a way to do it. You can go to data, name ranges, and you can like add a name range to a specific cell. And so next time you want to reference that specific cell, instead of saying like A1 or D5, you just reference that named range, which is like, my variable or, new value or whatever you want to call it. And so I feel like let is like a more somewhat user-friendly way of doing name ranges, but at the same time, let is kind of hard to understand and use in this as well. And so another reason why I gave it a 2 is because it's not that easy to understand, and especially for a beginner user. So here's an example. So let's say I have in cell A43, I have product, and then cell B, I have column B, I have the ratings for all these products. So imagine 3 products in column A: red t-shirt, black jeans, hat. And then column B, C, and D, I have the January ratings, like product ratings for these products. And in column E, I want to get the average score, but I don't want to just say, average the 3 numbers from B, C, and D. I want to say, if the average rating across January, February, March for this product, if it is greater than 4, I want the output to say high. If the average rating is between 3 to 4, I want it to say medium. And if it's 3 or below, I want it to say low. So if you were to do this today in Google Sheets, I'm just going to zoom in a little bit, you would say equals if average. I would select these 3 cells from B44 to D44, average of these 3 cells. If this is, what did I say, greater than 4, then put the words high, comma, but if the average is greater than, what did I say, if it's the average rating is between 3 and 4, then give it a medium. So basically I want to say if the average is greater than 3, then say medium, and then in all other cases I just want it to be low because it's just going to be below 3. And fill, and that's what you get, because just double check, I can get the average score really quick here on the right side in column F. And you can see here that, yeah, it's basically outputting a medium, high, or low depending on what the average score is. A pretty typical nested if statement where you have, if the average is greater than 4, then high, then the false branch is another if average. So pretty simple, or relatively simple nested if statement. If I were to use let, I could write equals let. Close this helper out. Let parentheses. And I first give it a variable name. I want to call it avg underscore rating. This is like the variable I use to find the average rating, comma, and then this is where I actually give it the average formula. So I first write avg underscore rating. That's my variable name. Then I write average, left parentheses, select my data, and then here's where I write the if statement as my formula expressions. I write equals if avg underscore rating is greater than 4, then high. Otherwise, if avg underscore rating is greater than 3, then medium. Otherwise, low in all other cases. And it gives me the same results. And let's break down this let statement here in Google Sheets. So the first parameter is the variable name, avg underscore rating. I then give it the output. I want the output of average of B44 to D44 to go into that avg underscore rating variable. And now that that happens, I can use that avg underscore rating variable elsewhere in the formula without having to say average left parentheses B44. So it's kind of a quick and easier way to reference the output of the formula. And this formula, it doesn't seem like you're saving that much space or time because it's a simple nested if statement. But for more complicated formulas, you can have multiple named lets, or what do you want to call these, named variables in the let statement, and use them throughout the formula. So this may actually make readability and also debugging easier for really long, complicated formulas. But in this case, it's really not that much easier because you only have one variable. And again, this feels really similar to name ranges. In this case, the name range wouldn't really work because we have 3 different cells here. But if you only had one cell with an output formula that you want to reference elsewhere, and this is really common in financial models where you have a bunch of inputs on one sheet that you want to use elsewhere in your model. In this case, this is where you might want to think about using the let function, because you can use this variable name elsewhere in the formula expression, as they call it. So it's a way, I think, to bridge the gap also to between people who are simply working in spreadsheets all day and perhaps people that want to get into using Google Apps Script or maybe Office scripts or if you're in Excel, because now you're thinking about treating formulas as variables versus just like, oh, this formula outputs this one thing, and then that's what gets outputted onto my spreadsheet. In this case, you're now be able to use this variable name elsewhere in your formula, and it starts to get you to thinking into like, oh, what if I can use variables in Google Apps Script and other places? So I think it's kind of like a gateway to scripting if you've never done it before. So in that sense, it's probably not the most approachable function for a beginner spreadsheet user, and maybe it's not meant for a beginner spreadsheet user for that matter. So that's why I gave it a usefulness rating of a 2. All right, so that kind of is the list of new functions. I mean, these are all the functions that were listed in that blog post I mentioned, I linked to in the first paragraph of the show notes. Looking back again, I think the most useful one is probably this like the 2 call and 2 row formulas. Just a simple way to kind of move data into like one single column or one single row. And that's kind of my thinking on that.